coming down from the leadership itself. So when the leadership wasn't seen or wasn't passing messages down, nobody in government or in an official position knew how to react. They weren't even sure that the leadership was still in the country, having seen what happened in Tunisia. So they tended to keep their options open. When the script did come down, it was pretty crude and ineffective. I was called in every day over a period in mid-February, or about the third week in February, by either the Foreign Minister or the Prime Minister, to be given variations of the same pretty unconvincing narrative. The story was always that reports of civilian deaths and injuries in Benghazi and other cities in the east were greatly exaggerated. The people provoking them, leading demonstrations, were very dangerous Islamists and criminals, and unless the UK, the US, France fully backed the regime in Tripoli, we would find ourselves having to deal with an al-Qaeda-run state in eastern Libya and possibly all over Libya. Of course, not even all members of the government were convinced by the story they had to tell us. In fact, one member of the Gaddafi family asked for a private meeting with me, at which he burst into tears and begged me to help him find a flight to the Gulf to get away, because he thought the game was up. And that was only a few days after the demonstrations started. Clearly, he didn't feel that he could trust the rest of his family to look after him. So, as Jason has explained, the situation was quite unlike Tunisia and Egypt. There was just a complete vacuum. The uprisings were not planned. They didn't start with a political objective. They just escalated. In the early days, as the government overreacted and people were killed, so it stoked up bad feeling. I can remember, particularly in Tripoli, real anger and revulsion going through the city after government troops in the east fired at mourners at a funeral procession when they were burying one of the people killed in the first demonstration. That really upset a lot of people. Nor were those who did emerge to lead the revolution particularly focused on reforming government or just on removing the top leaders. Once it became an outright confrontation, both sides knew that there was no room for compromise or mediation. Either the system, which Gaddafi had built up very much centered on his own personality, would prevail and restore the status quo, or else it would go completely and have to be replaced by something new. One of my other strong memories of that period is the challenge of evacuating British nationals and the challenge all foreign embassies had of trying to get their nationals safely out of Libya, given how fast things deteriorated. Of course, we all had drawn up, as we do in many countries, contingency plans for what you might do when this happens, and we practice them regularly. And as I'm sure happens in other places, when reality kicks in, the plan doesn't bear any relation to what you might be able to do. In the case of us in Tripoli, for example, and the same I know in many other embassies, all our plans were based on the idea that we would draw up convoys in Tripoli and organize convoys of vehicles to drive people across the border into Tunisia. Well, at the time, Tunisia was in flames, and very quickly the road from Tripoli to Tunisia became impassable. And in fact, one family on my staff who needed urgent medical treatment and for whom we got an air ambulance in on the other side of the Tunisian border, tried to drive across to Tunisia. And very nearly came to a sticky end when they were stopped by roadblocks on the way to Tunisia, and they only escaped thanks to the ingenuity of their driver. So essentially, people were stuck where they were, and it's a vast country with many expatriates working in remote locations and desert oil fields far from anywhere. You could never be quite sure who was there at any one time because they tended to rotate every few weeks. So establishing who was where and trying to get them out was a full-time job and a nightmare. And seeing, welcome Professor Graham Barker here, a veteran of many excavations in Libya going back many decades. I think his team weren't actually there, but David Mattingly's group from Leicester University were actually excavating in the south of Ghadames in the desert, but fortunately they were able to drive out into Tunisia just in time. So essentially people in the city only had two ways, in the Tripoli area only had two ways of getting out, either by sea or by air. The view out of my window over the sea it would have been slightly comic in other circumstances. The Libyan Navy in Tripoli had 3 1950s era warships, which I think if they'd ever been used would have been more of a danger to their crew than to anybody they attacked. But they trundled round from the naval base and were arranged in the commercial port. So as we all looked out of our windows, you saw the 3 warships there with their guns trained on the city. Well, probably not very effective, but the message was very clear. We all knew then that what the government thought of its people. The airport was even worse. The airport is a little way south of Tripoli, out of town. There were only a few hours a day when the road was safe to drive to the airport. But all the migrant workers in Tripoli, from the subcontinent, from Tunisia, from Morocco, from Egypt, were abandoned by their employers and really just camped at the airport. The governments were unable to fund flights out. The result was that anybody else, any British person who arrived at the airport and actually with a place on a plane sent to pick them up in the airport, had to find their way through many thousands of people camped out in front of the airport, and it really was a case of sort of wading in and fighting through. So, another problem was that the local authorities, I mentioned that in the absence of any clear instructions from government, people were hedging their bets and stayed at home, so civil servants couldn't be found at their desk. Civil aviation authority workers were not in their offices, and so the Foreign Office was chartering planes from here. The charter companies were refusing to take off because they'd filed their flight plans for civil aviation in Tripoli and hadn't had permission to land. Well, when we sent somebody round, in the Civil Aviation Authority, on the fax machine were a pile of faxes coming in from all around the world from governments asking permission to land. Nobody was there to deal with them, so we had to say, insurance companies didn't like it, but in the end they had to agree. You just take off, and when you get over the airport, you ask the control tower for permission to land. Don't worry about niceties like flight plans. Otherwise nothing would have happened. To compound it all, that particular period in mid-February was the worst weather I've ever experienced in Tripoli before, during, or since. There were storms every day, very high winds, pouring rain, so the camp of people at the airport turned into a mud bath. The American embassy, we thought very cleverly, to get round the problems at the airport, chartered a hydrofoil in Malta and brought it into the harbour to take people out. It quickly filled up with people. They were still there 4 days later because the seas were too rough for it to sail. So it seemed that the gods were against us and everything was making it more difficult. Moving on to the political issues, one of the other big memories I have of that period was a great diplomatic success elsewhere, which we thought at the time was very significant in the international consensus that built up around taking tough action against the Libyans when the Libyan army threatened the civilian population of Benghazi, and when there was a growing refugee crisis on the borders. The mandate that was given by the UN Security Council, the UN resolutions, the Arab League statements and so on, the wide international consensus that something had to be done to stop the regime was I think, wasn't unique, but it was quite new, and we all thought that this was a new sense of commitment by the international community to make good on the so-called right to protect obligation. Of course, later on, the way in which NATO interpreted that mandate to support the uprising, support the rebel forces, right through to the fall of Tripoli and the defeat of Gaddafi, created serious divisions in the Security Council, which have made it impossible at the moment to think of arranging the same sort of consensus in favour of new intervention elsewhere in the same way for the foreseeable future. And it has, for example, greatly complicated handling of the crisis in Syria. Jason spoke about the dispersed nature of the uprisings in the periphery. That wasn't always evident here at the time, partly because of the way the media covered the crisis. Not entirely their fault, they didn't have access to many parts of Libya, but I can remember here being rather surprised, turning on my television in the evening sometimes, to see correspondents on the so-called front line between the rebel forces and Gaddafi's forces between Sirte and Ajdabiya in the oil towns in the Sirte Basin, talking about the daily skirmishes there as if this was a major front line and decisive battles were taking place which would determine the outcome. And when there wasn't much to report, saying this may result in a stalemate and a division of Libya into east and west, with the east controlled by the rebels and the west by Gaddafi. Of course, what was going on there was just a sideshow. The real action already was in places that were still resisting the government's rule in the west, like Misrata, parts of the Jebel Nafouza, even in the south, where cities changed hands several times at that time. And in Tripoli, where already the underground resistance groups were improving their coordination and their planning for the eventual uprising there. That's where the outcome of the conflict was eventually decided, and where already the leadership in Benghazi and Doha, the NTC leadership, were concentrating their planning. Jason already mentioned also the history of suspicions and divisions between tribal and groups and communities within Libya, and certainly in the Italian period, the Italians overcame resistance in the Jebel Nafouza in particular by dividing and ruling, enlisting and bribing particular leaders and enlisting their support in overcoming their traditional neighbours and enemies. Gaddafi adopted exactly the same approach as the Italians, rewarding loyal towns in the areas and loyal communities and starving others of resources. That was his common tactic. And the current calls for federalism and devolution in Libya have to be seen in that context. They're not inspired by feelings of regional or tribal identity even, or particularly about political power. They're very much focused on access to economic resources and everybody getting a fair share of the cake. Under Gaddafi, the state revenues were all held in Tripoli and dispersed according to his whim. People in the periphery had to go to Tripoli and petition for them. Those who were loyal and did what he asked were rewarded. Those who did not didn't get them. 2 years after the uprising started, people in many centres in the periphery have yet to see the real benefits of any public investment in new services or infrastructure in their areas. So many of them assume that it must be elites in Tripoli who are sitting on the cash, withholding funding to punish them or spending it on themselves. In fact, the money is still sitting in the bank in Tripoli. And they all, I find if you talk to people, for example, in Tobruk, everybody on the streets in Tobruk will tell you exactly how much oil was exported through the terminal there the week before and how much revenue it brought into the government. So they're saying, we know so many £1 million was earned last week, where is it? In fact, as I say, the money is still in the bank in Tripoli because the government has not really developed the mechanisms and the confidence to spend it effectively. ministers and officials there have grown up in a system that rewards blind loyalty rather than the ability of free thinking and confident decision making. Under Gaddafi, all key decisions were taken at the top, and the penalty for anybody further down the chain who took a decision which subsequently proved to be considered wrong was very severe. So if you weren't sure you were doing what was wanted, you made sure you prevaricated. And corruption was also rife. So the administrative machine now, even though it has some new faces, many of them are the same, finds it more convenient to put off spending decisions if they can. Finally, two positive thoughts to end on. The Libyan population is remarkably homogenous and wary of extremist solutions. As we've seen recently with public demonstrations in the east against militia excesses, there is still, and there has been since the uprising, a strong public commitment to building a better society in Libya and to resisting any groups who threaten to hijack the government. And leading on to that more widely, people often ask about the high hopes generated by the Arab Spring or Arab Awakening in North Africa in 2011, which seems to have fizzled out and certainly has since been eclipsed by the terrible bloodshed in Syria. But actually, the Arab Spring was never going to transform the whole Middle East in 6 months. In my view, it would take a generation to have its full impact. I do think that events in North Africa in 2011 marked a very significant fundamental shift, which may not be evident now, but it will be one day. It's no longer conceivable, for example, that a Gaddafi-style dictator could return to power in the Middle East. The people of the region, especially the young, but not only them, will no longer accept being totally excluded from political and economic life. That's a fact that's changed. And modern technology makes it much more difficult, of course, for regimes to control access to information or remain totally unaccountable. So I think all governments across the region are having to come to terms with that change. They might be able to string it out, but those that can adapt to reflect it will survive. Those that cannot may not. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, now to turn to Noman Benotman,